coming to listen to my talk. So the title actually suggests that I will talk about the current events, but actually I will go a little bit into the history and talk about the emergence of Israeli right, but not only about Israeli right, but also I will try to point out to this sort of foundational questions of Israel as well as its inconsistencies and paradoxes, as much as its division and how shift to the right in Israel means further division and further disintegration in the Israeli social and political context. So any student who deals with Israeli politics comes across this very foundational, very important question of what does the right and the left mean in the Israeli context, and how should we deal with it? Are we really, when we look at the case, are we really talking about this right and left as as we speak in the French case or the Turkish or let's say the British case, or are we rather talking about the right and right of the right and right of the right of the right? So what kind of political context we're talking about? Nobody has a clear answer to that, but we can bear this question in mind while walking through the Israeli political history. And I will mainly argue as a macro theme in my talk, I will mainly argue that this shift to the right, which all the time occurs from the very beginning of Israeli political history, this shift to the right is a divisive and disintegrating process. And I think this is the most foundational question of Israeli politics, as well as that of Zionism, which has been asked mostly implicitly and sometimes explicitly in the last century and a half. What is the Jewish state for? Why do we need to have a Jewish state? And I'm talking about it from this Zionist perspective, and also in my talk I will be trying to give this Israeli perspective to the current events and the necessity of the Jewish state. Why do we need to have a Jewish state? This is the most foundational and probably one of the most divisive questions in the Israeli context, because it leads to some diverging paths. I mean, there are two opinions here amongst the Zionists. The first one is we need a Jewish state because we Jews want to be a nation among others. We need to get normalized. We want to be normalized. And so we want to be like any other people in the world. This is the first option. And this is the first answer. For example, when you look at the case of David Ben-Gurion, about whom I will talk a little bit more in the coming slides, he basically says that we Jews want to have beggars. We want poor Jews. We want homeless Jews in the streets. We just want to be like in other normal state in Europe or in the world. And this is one of the options. What about the second option? Either we will make Jews a nation among others, or we will keep the Jewish exceptional position as a light unto the nations. The last week, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu talked about this mention to this book of Isaiah, one of the books in the Old Testament, and he basically said that, he was apparently talking to these American evangelicals, and he basically said that let's altogether look at the book of Isaiah and read the book of Isaiah and come to terms with the current situation. What does the book of Isaiah say? Israelites, Hebrews, Jews, they are a light unto the nations. They are a light unto the nations, but they are not a nation. They are not taking the form of nation to be a light unto the nations. They are a light unto the nations, and they need to be in diaspora. This is what the Jewish theology says. When you look at the most orthodox sources of the Jewish theology, you basically come across the idea that Jews all the time need to be in exile, which means Jews should never have sovereignty, right? So there are these two diverging paths, and one of them is normalization, and the other one is the exceptionalism, the Jewish exceptionalism. So when we look at the case of these two figures, one of them is Theodore Herzl, and Abdurrahman talked about both of them in his talk. One of them is Theodor Herzl, and the other one is Vladimir Jabotinsky, two very Zionist figures, two founding fathers. One of them is the founding father of political Zionism, who basically said that Jews need a homeland because there's this Jewish question in Europe, Jews have nowhere to go, so we just need somewhere to go. This should be Palestine, but if not Palestine, this could be Argentina or somewhere else in the world. And the other guy is Vladimir Jabotinsky, and he's also a journalist, like Theodor Herzl, but he's a Russian Zionist. And he has a rather different approach to the question of Jewish homeland. So in the Church Zionist Congress, when the Brits suggested somewhere other than Palestine to the Zionists to build up their homeland, Theodor Herzl said we can definitely consider somewhere else, and took this to the Zionist Congress. But in the Zionist Congress there was a huge disagreement, and in the fifth Zionist Congress, a year after the death of Theodor Herzl, this Uganda plan, because the Brits had suggested Uganda as a place where Jews could found their own states, thanks to Russian Zionists, this Uganda plan was taken off the shelf and it was thrown into the dustbin of history. So Uganda plan was off the table. So in the fifth Zionist Congress, having a Jewish state anywhere other than Palestine was not possible because of the resistance of Russian Zionists. So Theodor Herzl was a practical man. He wrote a small pamphlet, which is called Unishta, and Abdurrahman mentioned it. He talked about a very, very practical plan of establishing a Jewish state. And when you look at the Jewish state, the Jewish state, his pamphlet, you basically see that he talks about very practical matters. How should the Jewish workers work? I mean, how many hours do they need to work a day? What time should they wake up? And how should the rabbis be acting in the Jewish state? How should the roads be, factories, etc.? So it's a very practical program, very much reflecting the personality of Theodor Herzl. And compared to today's Zionists, he rather looked like and talked like a European colonizer. He had nothing to do with Judaism as a religion. When he went to Jerusalem, all the time he talked about the dust and the backward Jews in Jerusalem, and he hated it. Really early Zionists hated Jerusalem. They really wanted to have Tel Aviv as their model city. That's an interesting fact. So he was a man from Vienna, Viennese Jewish journalist with a certain certificate, and he was a man of salute with a rather diplomatic posture. When we look at Vladimir Jabotinsky, we see a rather different profile. He is a journalist. Actually, he worked as a journalist in Istanbul during the second constitutional period. He wrote for Istanbul. But he was from Russia, and his Russian Zionist origin, his Russian Zionist background explains his rather militant outlook to the issue. While Theodor Herzl all the time told that we need to handle this by befriending all these empires and emperors, we need to act with diplomacy, we need to convince people to the Zionist cause, and we need to ask it from the emperors. Vladimir Jabotinsky rather said we can only solve it with guns and blood. Without war, we cannot really solve anything. So on the one hand, you see that political Zionism tried to solve things with diplomacy. That meant Zionists, political Zionists, Herzl being the chief of them, rather suggested that we need to work with diplomacy, we need to convince empires and emperors to our cause, and they need to provide us some sort of privileges in Palestine. People like Vladimir Jabotinsky said, we cannot be part of the world. We exist against the world. While Herzl said, we will act together with the world. Vladimir Jabotinsky said, we will act against the world. And these two approaches forms the two poles of Israeli politics. And since 1977, I will talk about what happened in 1977 in a while. The group, the pole that says we will act against the world is against us, so we will be against the world. They are the ruling powers since 1977 in Israel. And this is what Israeli right is. We are not going to act with the world, we are going to act against the world. Because we are exceptional. Because the world has sent us to exile. We have always been in exile. We have been exiled from history. We have been exiled from our land, by Romans, by I don't know whoever, by Assyrians, and we have the Holocaust. So all this exile mentality, all the way from the Assyrian exile from the 500 something BCE, all the way to the Holocaust in from 1933 to 1945. We see this consistent, continuous memory of exile against exile of Jews, and they being dispersed from the lands that they've been to. So when these people, when these revisionists, rather right-wing Zionists, when they look at the history, they see that we are against the world is against us, so this is how it is going to happen. So we will act with gun and blood, contrary to what Theodore Herzl used to say. It does not mean that Theodore Herzl was not a right-wing man. I mean, he was not definitely a leftist, right? But he believed in diplomacy. He all the time wanted to befriend these emperors. Here you see him with Kaiser Wilhelm in the Wilhelm II's famous visit to the Middle East. Actually, do we? Is this with him, Kaiser Wilhelm and Theodore Herzl? It is not. This is one of the earliest photoshops in world history. He actually wanted to see Kaiser Wilhelm. When he learned that Kaiser Wilhelm was going to visit Palestine, he rushed to Palestine and he stood on the way of Kaiser Wilhelm. And he expected Kaiser Wilhelm II to stop and greet him and talk to him a little bit. But this did not happen. Kaiser Wilhelm just said hi and just went on with his road. And then he couldn't even have a photo taken with Kaiser Wilhelm. So they had this photo of Kaiser Wilhelm and added Theodore Herzl here with this Photoshop. What does it say? It is a funny story, but it says something. Theodore Herzl had his photo taken right on the spot, to have it published on the newspaper. He loved to be seen with emperors. One of the earliest postcards of Abdullah II was published by Zionists. For what? There is Abdullah II at the top, and at the bottom, a little bit down, there is Theodore Herzl. And it is a postcard for celebrating the Jewish New Year, which writes, the heart of the Sultan is in the hands of God. What? I mean, not Abdullah II. A Jewish New Year card, I mean, it sounds so weird now, but he loved to be seen with emperors, so he believed in empires. And he was not an outright enemy of the Ottoman Empire. He wanted to be, I mean, early Zionists, especially people like Theodore Herzl, and later people like David Ben-Gurion and so on, they wanted to be part of the empire. They wanted to have their Jewish homeland be established under the umbrella of the empire. But things have changed a little bit when the First World War erupted. And we talked about and this is more about Vladimir Jabotinsky. And this is the emblem of his political party, Irgun. I mean, it's not the political party, but it's this militia organization. Abdurrahman talked about it. So there was Vihat Haganah, which was more like safety. David Ben-Gurion's later on it turned into the Israeli army. And we have Irgun, this militia organization run by, established by Zev Jabotinsky and run by others later on. And it has a very interesting emblem. I don't know, it is not big enough, but can you see something here? I mean, what do you see?
Has the East Sharia, Jordan connected to it.
Exactly. So this is exactly. This is the and also symbolizes this long stripe, long line symbolizes the river of Jordan. So this is Palestine, and this is currently Jordan. And this is what Vladimir Jabotinsky and Israeli right came to believe: territorial maximalism. We need we need a territory as big as possible in order to be able to defend it. Since they believed in guns and rifles and blood, and they believed in war, they said we need to have maximally the biggest possible territory on Earth in Palestine. So this very much sums up the position of Israeli right-wing from at its very birth, territorial maximalism. Right? So we what was the time? For 1948. In 1948, Israel declared itself an independent state in May. And this happened only a month later. And this sharing of a ship on the coast of Tel Aviv almost led Israel to a civil war. And what was the thing? It is called the Ottawa Affair. It happened in June 1948. So Abdul Rahman again talked about it. We mentioned it. So when Jews organized in groups to fight against the British, so it was the Mandate period. So they got organized in groups. So we had Haganah. There was Haganah, and Haganah was rather this official, more formal army. And there was Irgun. Irgun was much more right-wing, which was established by Zev Jabotinsky. It was much more right-wing. And again, they believed in war. So this was the group, Irgun was the group that carried out attacks against this British opponents, against British officials, against British soldiers, against anything British. They just wanted British to leave so that they could declare the independence of the Jewish state. So they were carrying out terrorist attacks all the time against the British. Haganah was also doing it. Irgun was much more radical and much more brutal in this sense. So when the war was over, they declared the independence of the state. So we had Haganah and we had Irgun. And Irgun was again much more right-wing than Haganah. Ben-Gurion, who was the head of the Haganah at that time, who later on became the first prime minister of Israel, he was the head of Haganah, and he said to Menachem Begin, said, okay, listen, you're the leader of Irgun, but we need to unify this army because we don't need a militia organization within the state anymore. And they agreed. They agreed, but they did not really agree because the reason was Menachem Begin, the first right-wing leader of Israel, he made some agreements in France with the French state. He said, if I become the prime minister, he arranged some certain agreements, some secret agreements with the French state. And the French helped Irgun people sell some weapons to Tel Aviv, basically to Palestine, so that they could use them against another political rivals. And when it happened, when the ship arrived, it was only not even 1 month, it was maybe some 15 days after the independence. And what happened? And it was the 48 war was almost over. It was nearly over. So when the ships arrived, when filled with all these arms and ammunition, when we said to Menachem Begin, to the Irgun leader, listen, you will give all these arms to me. And he said, no, I will keep like 1/5 of them for my own militia. And he said, you have no militia. He said, I have. And at that time, Ben-Gurion suspected that Menachem Begin is going to carry out a coup d'etat against Ben-Gurion. And Ben-Gurion said, just shell and sink the ship. Both sides were Zionists. Both sides were Zionists. Both sides were Israelis. 16 people died. And most of the Haganah fighters refused to shell, refused to open fire against the ship because they thought, why are we opening fire against it? And this has been a very divisive issue at the very beginning of the state. And it was almost leading to a civil war between certain communities in Israel. But Menachem Begin stepped up and said, okay, we are dissolving, we don't want the brother blood be spilled, so we are fine, we are stopping this. And that was the end of the political career of Menachem Begin for a while. Not forever, forever. And I'm showing this because this is an important affair, not very well known, but it's important to understand the beginnings of the right in Israel. A group in Israel always believes that Israel needs to be at war somewhere in the world. Of course, the Arabs is the first right, but Israel needs war to stand on its own feet. And at that time, David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, he was from the Mapai party, he was from the Labour Party, he was a socialist Zionist, unlike Menachem Begin. And he said, and this, the 1948 war, it was the founding war of Israel. And this war was not an easy one. And Israel is victorious with the help of the outside world, Czechoslovakia and some other countries. But the 1948 war did not mean a very bright victory for Israel. Why? Because it was a period of depression and anxieties and many questions. And everybody in the Israeli society mainly asked, is it going to survive? Is the state going to survive? Are we going to survive? And at the time, David Ben-Gurion was not an exception to that question, to these questions, because he always had in his mind, how are we going to make up a society and a state out of these very divided, deeply divided society? They all come from Yemen and Lithuania and Germany and Turkey and Yemen and all around the world. And how are we going to make up a people out of these people, these very divided groups? And he came with the idea of Mamlakut, making a society out of this. And he was the winner of this Altalena affair, so he was also the winner of the 1948 war. So he won against the Arabs, and he won against the right wing inside. So he initiated a very powerful, very strong process of integrating the society. So basically, European Jews, Yemenite Jews, Turkish Jews, no one could speak its own language. So he all the time imposed this necessity of speaking Hebrew. And this early generation of the Israeli Zionists all the time talk about creating this new Jew out of this new Israeli Hebrew, out of this exiled Jew. How are we going to create this a new people, a new society, strong, masculine and masculine, productive, who does not only read books, preferably they won't read books at all. They should rather produce, they should rather be muscular, they should be able to fight wars and raise against the enemy and all these things. So he started a war against his own society almost, because the existing people were all coming from other countries and they were not really in favor of this Ashkenazi process of Israeli making. It was a very Ashkenazi, it was a very wide, it was a very European colonial process of making a people out of a mosaic. And following this Ashkenazi hegemony, there was this huge grievances in the Israeli society because all these non-Ashkenazi Jews who came from the outside, basically they're called Mizrahim today, Easterners, they're being alienated from the society. They did not really feel like home anymore. They did not really feel like a part of the Israeli society, and this would survive further. And when we come to the 1967 war, what happened was this. Again, it's called the Six-Day War by the Israeli historians, and it is called the October War by Egyptian historians and by Arab historians, and it is called Nakba by the Arab world. So what happened was these 5 Arab states got defeated by Israel, long story short. And it was a very humiliating process, especially for leaders like Jamal Abdel Nasser and other Arab leaders, because it was the height of this Arab socialism, and there was this United Arab Republic, and it was a huge shock for the Arab world. And what about Israel? Israel, it was a huge moment of joy and euphoria. What was the reason for that? The reason for that was, by the way, I took this map from the website of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so what happened was Israel basically invaded, occupied Egypt, this part, occupied kind of the desert and also Golan Heights. Most important of all, Israel occupied East Jerusalem and the West Bank. All these areas have been occupied. So Israel tripled its length in just 6 days. It was a huge event of euphoria and joy for Israel. Not only for tripling its length, but the most important of all, Israel occupied the West Bank and Jerusalem, the East Jerusalem. What does it mean? It means, at the very beginning, what Herzl wanted for Jews as a Jewish state was only to be a refuge for these Jews who are escaping from Europe. Herzl really wanted it to be a home where Jews could come and settle and take care of their needs. But now, Israel was not a refuge anymore. Israel was not a refuge, it was rather this huge homeland. I mean, this is not a huge land, but Israel finally, from its own perspective, finally conquered the lands of its ancestors. Finally, all those lands mentioned in the Old Testament were in the Israeli sovereignty. What did that mean? So it was not all Zionism anymore. So now Zionism had a much more religious side, and it was coupled with this biblical discourse. So now, basically, the Jews conquered this city of the temple, Jerusalem, and all these cities here where they had the Machpelah cave, the cave of Sayyidina Ibrahim and their Abraham, and all these prophets and everything. So basically, all Jewish history, let's say more than 80% of the Jewish history goes on in these lands. And this was the thing that early Zionists were very afraid of. At the very beginning, in Russia and in Europe, especially in Europe, these very secular Zionist leaders said, if we go to Palestine, it's not going to be good for us. We are trying to make Jews distance themselves from Judaism. If they go to Jerusalem, if they go to West Bank, if they go to this land, they are going to remember their Judaism today or tomorrow. And this is what happened. So now, Zionism, with the 1967 war, took a much more religious form. And it was what? So it was a euphoric moment for Israeli society, a moment of happiness, huge joy, and it was a moment of settlement. Settlers, or all these radical settlers in the Israeli society began to flow into West Bank in order to settle the lands of their forefathers, lands of their ancestors. And this was a moment for the Israeli right. Basically, this is a very famous photograph. For the first time, they went to Italy, and they refused to, for the first time, right after the '67 war, they went to Italy and they refused to leave Italy. And they just started their settlement in Italy, in today's Italy city, they call it Hebron. And since then on, all this, this secular brutality goes on and on since that very day. And finally, I mean, that was an expected moment, especially after the '67 war. this party, which is called Kach, in Hebrew it's called Kach. In English we can translate it as this way. That's, this way we can only deal with Arabs. This American rabbi established this Das party, and he basically, Meir Kahane, his name is Meir Kahane, and he basically said that only by expelling Arabs, exiling them, and if necessary by slaughtering them, by just murdering them, we can get rid of the Arab population and we can only arrive at a proper Jewish state. So everything needs to be Jewish, right? So we can kill them. It was the 1971 when he came up with this idea, and this is his book, They Must Go. But of course, they must go does not always mean they must go. They must go or we kill them. So that was a moment. And then 1973 war comes. What does happen then? Of course, 67 war was a huge defeat and humiliation for the Arab states, especially for Israel. And it was not, I mean, they were not, of course, I mean, apparently there would be an aftermath to that, right? So, Yom Kippur is an important day for Jews. Why is it important? So, it's a holiday, but it is not a day of joy and festival. It is a day where they fast for 24 hours. They remember the destruction of the temple, and many other things. They remember the Holocaust, they remember all these huge massacres and calamities that happened in the Jewish history on this one day, and they fast for 24 hours. If there was anyone who has been there on a Yom Kippur, probably saw that all the roads are blocked with certain blocks. And where else do we have in the world where the airport is sealed off? It is fully closed, and the radios don't work. Nothing works in Israel when the Yom Kippur comes for 24 hours. Nothing. So you have these stone blocks on the roads. You cannot drive your car. Everything stops, and life stops on Yom Kippur. And on Yom Kippur, what happened? Egypt and Syria attacked Israel. It was that, that happened in the past too. In 48 this happened, in 67 this happened. But the problem was, Israel was not aware of what was coming. So Israel didn't have a clue that Egypt and Syria would attack. And when they learned that there was no intelligence service working, they couldn't call up the reserve army to the service. Tanks did not work. Israel lost more than 500 tanks or something. And Syrian army took control of the north of Israel, and Egyptian army came all the way to here, to this line. It was a huge disaster for Israel. Only after 4 days, the Prime Minister Golda Meir could call President Nixon and ask for some arms. And America immediately shipped some arms. They sent it by plane, basically. They flew to Israel. And this way, Israel could get back on its feet. Otherwise, it was a destruction. It was a total destruction. Not official numbers say that more than 10,000 Israeli soldiers died in the 73 war. It was a huge shock for the Israeli society. In the 67 war, it was a huge time of joy and euphoria, and this ended swiftly in the 1973 war. In Israeli social psychology went all the way back to post-48 period. Now, the depression, the anxiety, and all these questions regarding survival, they all came back. It was not a time of joy anymore. And here you see, you know the singer? Leonard Cohen, the Canadian Jewish singer. He came all the way to Sinai after the Israeli army took control of occupied the Sinai, took it back from Egypt. Leonard Cohen came there and sang for the for the Israeli soldiers in Sinai. What else? What else happened? There was the huge war for the center right in Israel. So Golda Meir was the prime minister at the time, and he was coming from the line of David Ben-Gurion. So he was part of this group who wanted Israel to make a part of the world. They believed in diplomacy. They more believed, I mean, of course they were ruling against Palestinians. There was war, there was killing, for sure. But they rather wanted to look nice to the outside world. They wanted to show that they are complying with the international law and things like that. But with the Yom Kippur War, this came to an end. And what came was 1977 elections. Yeah, it took some 4 years, but in these 4 years, Israel struggled with coalition crisis and governmental crisis, and all proper elections could be done in 1977. And who's this guy? This guy is this guy, Menachem Begin. So he went with the operator affair. He was not on the political scene until 1977, because he was basically excluded from the political domain. Nobody wanted to see him because he was the guy who took Israel to an almost civil war. There would almost be a civil war, and he was seen as the responsible one from this almost civil war. And only in 1977, after such a huge defeat, I mean, this is basically a defeat for Israel. Israel recovered from the defeat of America, so we cannot technically call it a defeat. After only such a defeat, Menachem Begin could come to power. And the name of the party was, and still is, Likud. And who's Likud? Likud is the party, the political party of Benjamin Netanyahu. So Likud is a political party. Came all the way from 1977 elections to today with brief intervals. I mean, only on certain occasions they couldn't establish a government. They couldn't have a prime minister. Beyond that, Likud has been the dominant party since that very time up until now. Shift to the right means further division and disintegration throughout the system. So Netanyahu's party came through since 1977. And you know what? The interesting thing is, right now, Benjamin Netanyahu's party remained in the center right. Can you imagine how much Israeli society and Israeli politics shifted to the right? Now, back then, Menachem Begin, the founder of the party, was a far-right figure. And now its representative, Benjamin Netanyahu, is the central right figure. So this much Israel is shifted to the right. Coming to our day, there's a very interesting trend. When we look at the period from the Six-Day War to the Yom Kippur War, basically from 1967 to 1973. So it is only 6 years. And we see the same trend between 2017 and 2022. Again, another 6 years. What happened in the 6 years was the Six-Day War. You should hear for Israel, euphoria and happiness and all these things. All the way until the Yom Kippur War, where this euphoria was cut down significantly and radically. And what happened in 2017 was, I'm sure you all remember, Donald Trump. He was not in all office. He was not a president. He was not an American president, even for a year. And he declared that he recognized Jerusalem as the Israeli capital. So it was in his first year in the office, Donald Trump recognized that. And I was in Jerusalem at the time. And there was, again, this euphoria was taking over. Okay, now we are good, we are fine. America is taking our back. We have Donald Trump in office. Nothing will happen to us. Nothing will happen to us. There was this very, very dominant vibe in the air. And what happened in 2023 is the October 7th. Israel was definitely not expecting such a thing. Definitely not expecting. And it caught them unprepared, definitely. I mean, everybody agrees on that. And again, when they, I mean, the trends on all what happened during these wars are very similar. In 1973, there was this huge fight between the government, between the Israeli government and between the Israeli army, I mean, government and the army. So generals were having a fight within themselves. They were blaming the politicians, and politicians were blaming the generals, and generals again had differences of opinions between themselves. So it is basically called the War of Generals. And again, in 2023, on October 7th, we had the same thing. Everyone blaming one another. They were all blaming each other. The intelligence was blaming the government, and government was blaming the army intelligence, and army people were blaming Netanyahu. And now again, everybody's blaming Netanyahu, and he is the one who, everybody looks at, he's the one who needs to go. This is for sure. So, both wars, this way, ended the periods of euphoria in Israel. So, I think what happened in these late 60s and early 70s could provide us a model for what is going to happen in the future. Because we saw the same thing. The same thing happened exactly 50 years ago. When you look at the dates, you see that the Yom Kippur War also began on October 7, 1973. So there are really interesting parallels. I would definitely recommend the students of the subject to have a look at it and see the parallels. You can come up with many other things. And that's it. Thank you. I think I have a little bit of time. So if you have any questions, comments, please.
What happened to the Likud after the Israeli intervention in the Lebanese civil war? From what I read, it was seen as a political failure by the Likud. At first, it was a success, but after a while, it turned into a complete political failure.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, at the time, politicians managed to blame the army for the losses because I mean, there was the Israeli army was taking, especially Ariel Sharon was he's the butcher. He was the one who really took the initiative and went further into all the way to Beirut. And at that time, Israeli politicians managed to blame it on him, and this way they survived. I mean, blaming on others is sometimes a survival tactic in the Israeli politics, but it does not seem to be working right now. Now,
Thank you. Again, we hear from the many experts that right-wing policies of Netanyahu turned out to be today's war in Israel, and some people, especially Jewish people around the world, are saying that that the Netanyahu period will not last after that. But there seems no people than Netanyahu as a figure after him. He seems really so stubborn or so ambitious to be there. It will be a decline of extreme right in Israel, or it will be more fanatic than ever. What we expect.
Thank you. Well, I think it will be, as you said, it's going to be more fanatic than ever. One of the first things that Netanyahu did right after the war was to establish an emergency government. There's such a thing in Israel when there is an emergency situation, when there is war or something. They can create this emergency government, and the prime minister can take into this government whoever he wants. And what Netanyahu did in this case was to create an emergency government. And the right-wing guys in Israel, the extreme right-wing guys, are this Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. These two guys are probably the most racist people the history has ever seen. So they are basically students of Meir Kahane, but they are even more extreme than him. So now the government is run by these people, the formal government of Israel. And Netanyahu created an emergency government after 4 days or something, and he took into government his former defense minister Benny Gantz. So Benny Gantz is a more like central right guy, so he's more like an essential right. Of course, he's the former chief of staff of Israel. In the past, he said we need to carpet bomb Gaza and take things like that. But when you look at Netanyahu, these guys, he little bit stays in the center right. And he worked with Benny Gantz in this emergency government. What does that mean? He didn't want to work with these two guys. The first reason is he's expecting anytime, the government is going to collapse. The government is going to collapse. And these two guys are going to take the country to another election. Because they want to take control of things. And they know that Netanyahu is. Netanyahu, knowing that, established, created an emergency government with Benny Gantz. I mean, these guys are sort of little too crazy. I mean, they can take Israel to war with anyone, with Saudi Arabia, with anyone, because what they need is war. They don't care what they need is war. And now Israeli society is so ready for that, and Netanyahu is aware of it. So it has a moderating effect on Netanyahu. So now Netanyahu is afraid of these far right guys he brought to power. But he will probably go. And probably they're gonna be more powerful. Oh yes.
So one of the things that the recent event has done, one of the things that the recent act that takes over 7, it challenged the narrative, the myth of the Israeli myth of it being like indestructible. And the way you describe 1973 is kind of how the events on October 7th are narrated. Israel was surprised. But the myth is so powerful, even in a place like Turkey. Some people talk about conspiracy, right? Netanyahu, in order to preserve his position, allowed for this kind of thing to happen so he can consolidate his base. Or, the right wing is so vicious that they want to carpet bomb Gaza, they needed 9/11. So these conspiracies are floating around. So my question to you is, like, looking at the long history of Israel, how viable is this myth of the indestructible Israel? Is there any credence to internal reasons for why Israel may have allowed or was not prepared for such an attack? How do we analyze the situation today?
Thank you. I mean, myths are myths, and myths do survive for a reason, just like that. But I think in this last war, these myths have been dispersed a little bit more, because now we have all these social media and Twitter and everything, and people are trying to understand the situation rather than arguing that at least most of the people that I've seen on social media, almost everyone, they're trying to understand the situation rather than saying that, oh, Netanyahu is again playing a game and now he's working his ways this way. I don't think myths are very powerful at this moment. They're rather trying to understand the situation. But Israel is very powerful in terms of creating the myths about itself. Even sometimes this anti-Semitic myths about itself. I mean, maybe you watch all these Netflix series such as Fauda or others like Tehran. You definitely come to see that, oh, Israel is very powerful. Or we tend to see these movies as, we tend to see these movies that we are trying to watch these movies by seeing it as the power tool of Israel. But for example, when you watch Paula, Israel is, the maker of Paula, it is made by an Israeli producer. And this guy has worked in this Mustarabi troops. He's worked as an intelligence officer who speaks Arabic, who looks like an Arab, and who goes into West Bank and doing whatever. So he did this business when he forced that he came up with this idea of Paula. And in Paula, they are contesting so many things. Israel basically says we have all the technical superiority, we have all these satellites, all these technical opportunities, all these technical tools to see, hear, listen to whatever they are talking about and whatever they are doing. And we have all our allies in Belgium, in Germany, in America, so we can fly anywhere in the world in how many hours we want. And we can get on the Palestinian diaspora. We are under keeper control. This is the image that they are creating, but on the other hand, they are telling that still we cannot really be successful in this business because we have all the technical capacities, but we cannot really do that. We can watch all these TV series from this perspective too. There's this, again, it was done by Khan. Khan is Israeli Broadcasting Corporation, Tehran, and other. When you see it, it's an action series, so you really like it. It really gets you. But again, you see all these conventions like, okay, we cannot really do it. We cannot work it against Iran. We are surviving, but we barely survive. So we can also see all these TV series from this perspective too. It is there. It is there. They are saying it themselves. And Israel, it's not an indestructible. No, this is not at all. And when you go to, when you go there, I don't know, talk to people, live there, you definitely see that it's all about America. It's all about the outside support. It has nothing to do with what is going on inside. It's rather from the outside support that helps Israel survive every single moment. Technology transfer, money, human capital, anything you want. You see that it's not really about the inside, it's rather about the outside. So it is not a surprise. What happened on October 7th, it's not a surprise at all. It didn't take me as a surprise. It was not, I think, about Israel. It was not about this, technical incapacities of Israel or something. It was about Iran having done his homework very well. This is what I think. Thank you.
You don't have time.
Oh,
Sorry, Abdurrahman, I'm really sorry, we don't have much time.
Yes, we have. If you watch the Mandalorian, you see that takes on is Jewish, and he makes the idea of those who wear the helmet, and those who take off the helmet, as being different spectrums of the Jewish world, moving to a new planet to be protected because of the destruction of their homelands. So when we watch these type of shows, they facilitate this sort of mythology, so it's important. So we're going to have to stop there, but we thank you very much.
If you're back, you can come in.
Okay, so our next speaker is Alice, who works on the next one. Alice is a journalist, and I thought it was necessary to have somebody from the field of the media to be here today as well, because a lot of what we're speaking about is from an academic perspective, from my perspective, from a theological perspective, and so forth, having this know-how and expertise about how narrative and mythologies and languages and data is constructed to create particular images, especially right now where there is a whole attempt on social media to debunk and disprove some of the lies that are going around. So, it's
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for inviting me. Can everyone hear me? Okay. So I'm just going to provide a kind of brief overview of how the conflict has kind of been portrayed in the media, and then afterwards maybe we can have a kind of Q&A, and I think that's kind of might be a better way of teasing some of the more some of the nuances out. As we kind of know, the media plays a very instrumental role in kind of shaping how we see kind of society, but it's also more than that. It's also a reflection of society. The media, as we've seen, plays also an important role in characterizing who's good and who's bad. And in that, it's also a very emotional output. And so when journalists are discussing and when they're talking about objectivity, they're also engaging in emotional language, and often they're using emotional language to shape the views of their audience. So firstly, a couple of kind of numbers. Prior to October the 7th, the UN estimated that between 2008, so October the 7th being when Hamas attacked Israel, between 2008 and 2023, 6,400 Palestinians were killed by Israel, and around 300 Israelis were killed by Palestinians. The reason why I say that also is because October the 7th was seen and was portrayed by the media as a landmark of it. Context was removed from the situation, and October the 7th became the starting point of the conflict and how then the media covered the conflict. In the kind of 3 weeks since then, more than 7,000 Palestinians have died, many of them kind of women and children. How the media then has engaged in portraying Palestinian victims and Israeli victims has, well, to put it politely, has been quite interesting. But we can also kind of compare it to how the media portrayed another conflict. And we can use this as a useful barometer in understanding then how the media approaches certain conflicts. So in the situation of Ukraine, following Russia's invasion, the media was very quick to align itself with one party, mainly Ukrainians. And it was very quick to distinguish who the good guys and the bad guys are. Russians, occupiers, the Ukrainians boldly and fiercely fighting against the occupiers. So it was a clear case of good and bad, good and evil. In the Palestinian context, as we've already seen, the narrative has been flipped. The Israelis are the ones in the Israelis are the Ukrainians, and the Palestinians are the Russians. And that framing has been widely disseminated. Israel is the victim, and the Palestinians are the perpetrators of massacres. And the reason why I kind of mentioned that is the media has certain... One second. So the reason why I mentioned that is that few outlets bothered to offer the context. And the reason why the context is often missing is because there is also a climate of fear in the journalistic world. The Israeli file is a very delicate file when journalists end up covering the conflict, but it also goes, there is a context of that, which is anti-Semitism. When Europe decided to deal with the scourge of anti-Semitism following World War II, they also banished notions of anti-Semitism in polite society, and so criticizing also Israel and has been seen largely as unacceptable. Whereas Islamophobia and anti-Arab sentiment is still considered and still seen as acceptable and practiced daily. And so the context of that then is that on the one hand, the Israelis are kind of seen as part of the European family, and so they are one of us, whereas the Muslims and the Arabs are the other. And so there is also a racialized element to this in how the media covers the conflict. The humanity of Jews is rooted in post-World War II Europe, whereas the humanity of Palestinians isn't seen as part of the equation. We can see this, for instance, in some of the language that's been used to describe Hamas. Hamas has been described as redefining evil, has been considered as both the Nazis, ISIS, and it's also tapped into imagery that's been deeply embedded into the fabric of society. For instance, the 9/11 attacks, which was seen as kind of a landmark moment, that's used to describe the situation in Israel. Or other emotive language, such as the worst crime to have happened to the Jews since the Holocaust. And the reason why that language is important is because it also feeds into what a lot of people have been educated in the West, which is, so we were speaking where we had lunch with some people here, I forgot their name, and we were discussing kind of the US education system. And the US education system, from a very young age, inculcates people to learn about the Holocaust. So when they were studying global history, they learned about the Holocaust, they learned about Hannah Frank. And so from a very young age, both in the US and in Europe, we learn about Nazi atrocities, we learn about the Holocaust, and it also imbues us with a certain emotion regarding certain events. So the moment you mention the Holocaust, there is a wealth of information behind it that has already been constructed, that you already learned it, and you can already and immediately associate who's good and who's bad. If those people are committing the Holocaust, then they are definitely the bad guys. Whereas in contrast, the media has largely removed context from the Palestinians. They called the attack unprovoked. Israeli officials used degrading language that would have been used against Jews once upon a time to describe Palestinians as human animals. The US administration and Western politicians described the conflict as one between good and evil, right and wrong. The media, by and large, also operates in this context, in particular Western media, mainstream media. And in turn, they also reflect the zeitgeist of their society. For instance, Israel's right to defend itself is seen as largely unquestionable in the face of undeniable atrocities. Whereas the Palestinian agency to talk about resisting an occupation is rarely mentioned in the media. When you read most articles, they caveat Israel's response under the title that Israel has a right to defend itself, to protect its sovereignty. The rights of Palestinians to defend themselves from an occupation that is under international law, they have the right to resist with most means, is rarely mentioned. Now, I'll focus on kind of 3 examples on how the media influences our perception of the conflict. One of them is meta-narratives. The other one is how do we think about numbers in terms of who dies. And also, thirdly, how we talk about deaths and which deaths. So the meta-narrative can be divided into 2, I would say, interconnected parts. There's the political, and there's also the racial. So I briefly mentioned before, the starting point of a conflict. A lot of the Western media has framed the conflict as starting on October the 7th. When the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres tried to offer a slightly more nuanced alternative, where he said, while he condemned the violence, there was a context to the violence, he was condemned by the US. He was also condemned by Israel, and his resignation was called for. But many on the media also faced that pressure to discuss context is to potentially be labeled as condoning Hamas's attacks. Many avoid doing so. By focusing on the 7th of October as a starting point, it also removes the context of the cycle of violence that started in 1948. For most media outlets, that's usually uncomfortable territory. We see that, for instance, the Guardian journalist, cartoonist, who decided to draw a cartoon depicting Netanyahu etching Gaza in blood, the cartoon was pulled and he was succinctly fired from his job. BBC Arabic is investigating several journalists for tweeting in regards to the Gaza conflict. These two examples also demonstrate one of two things. One of them is how support of Palestinians is policed. The secondly, it also can be contrasted with how journalists viewed the Ukraine war, for instance. Many followed the government lines at the start of the Ukraine conflict, and many were speaking in favor of Ukraine and in support of Ukraine's right to resist. But the Ukrainians were seen as, and I quote, blonde hair and blue eyes being killed. So with Ukrainians, there is a familiarity, and this moves on to the racial aspect of it. A US anchor at the time, when the Ukraine war started, said, "This isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades." And so whereas the Arab and the Muslim is portrayed as perpetually in conflict, the white, the racial, the in-group, the Ukrainian, the Israeli, they're not seen as perpetually in conflict. They are seen as part of the family. When a crime happens to them, it is portrayed as happening to us. When a crime happens to Palestinians, it's often seen as the other. Okay, is everyone looking first? Maybe I can pause there actually, and if anyone has any questions regarding to that first part, or to discuss something.
I have a general question, but maybe you'd like to finish first.
No, go for it.
Okay.
Gives me a break.
Okay, thank you. So, I want to tell you about the project I'm working on, since you are the expert here on media.
Uh-oh.
So, I'm working on a network called Zaytoon. Zaytoon is an open source network of activists and institutions using the liberating Hasbara to create and promote our narrative of resistance.
Right.
So Zaytoon aims at first instilling and consolidating the idea of Hasbara in Palestine activists. I will tell you what's Hasbara.
I know it's Hasbara.
And second, to build an ecosystem to sustain and develop it.
Right.
So as you know, controlling the narrative process and creating narratives and manipulating information is an essential element in modern warfare. And the Israelis call this Hasbara.
Right.
So it's a Hebrew word.
Yep.
And we are using the same word, but we are turning it into liberating Hasbara, or al-Hasbara al-Muqawama in Arabic. So we are working upon the idea that it's time to start and organize an effort to develop a liberating diaspora and create and promote our own narrative. So we are now working on, we actually edited and translated a handbook for liberating diaspora, and we are now working on translating it to Arabic, so we have it in English as a draft. So I was wondering what suggestions would you have in mind for us?
That's a good question.
You can think about it.
Okay, I can kind of ponder about it, and then we can discuss it afterwards.
Okay. Ellis, I have a question. So
At the moment, one of the things that people argue is that the legacy media is taking a hit here.
Right.
In particular, so social media has been able to give the Palestinians a voice. Protests have created a particular level of momentum, and social media in particular has created an alternative where the Israeli propaganda has been deconstructed and disproved continuously. Where do you see the role of legacy media right now, going forward, especially Western legacy media, in relation to what's happening?
So I can break that into two parts. Firstly, social media is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it has kind of democratized how information is spread, in that a large volume of people can push a particular agenda onto the news agenda in sheer numbers of discussing it. The downside, or kind of the flip side of that, is that social media companies also understand the power that they wield and are able to also manipulate who sees what. They can delete things, they can block accounts, they can so I think Instagram has pulled a lot of Palestinian posts, Facebook has also done so. So that's kind of a double-edged sword. On balance, it's probably still a very useful or somewhat useful outlet despite all of this, because the sheer volume, and this is, I guess, one of the kind of asymmetric advantages that Palestinians have, is that on social media they have a numerical advantage, and in public opinion they have a numerical advantage, and therefore people can go online and just, by the sheer volume of discussing something, it can't be ignored. In terms of legacy media, the fact that we get angry when legacy media doesn't cover things the way we want to suggests that they still have residual power. They're still institutions that are able to shape public opinion. And while it's nice to hope that legacy media will probably kind of fade away, they're still not going away anytime soon. So every time the BBC, for example, decides to write in the passive language regarding Palestinian deaths, but in the active language to discuss Israeli deaths, the media, people online get kind of mad about it. And the reason why they get mad about it, because they care what the BBC thinks, they care what the New York Times thinks, they care what the Guardian thinks and the Financial Times. And I don't know how to kind of get people not to care about it, but I think we also imbue these institutions with a degree of power, because we read them, we follow them, and in turn we then develop expectations regarding these institutions. Now there is a lot of independent smaller media outlets that reflect different narratives, but they're still by and large relatively small.
So that was going to be my second question, which is, you work for Middle East, for example, you work with Chelsea World. How do you feel the media in the region has done in comparison of trying to present a possible alternative narrative here, or try to create a particular form of momentum?
This is being recorded. Okay. So I won't tell you what TRT World does then. So in regards to Middle East Eye was set up in large part to correct misconceptions regarding the Middle East, and it will reflect viewpoints from people from the Middle East, and it's by and large staffed also from people from the region. And in that sense, it's able to reflect the stories that mainstream media largely kind of tend to forget. The problem always with having a media kind of company is there are black holes of money. You need to have a rich benefactor that can constantly fund you, especially when you're not state-backed. Even so, you can see with institutions like Al Jazeera, they still face certain pressures to change their output and change how they cover particular stories. The US Secretary of State told Qatar that Al Jazeera Arabic needs to tone down their coverage. And the reason why they say that is because Al Jazeera Arabic is inciting, or not inciting, but it's emotionally tapping into, in a very effective way, what people, the support that the region still has for Palestinians. And that then intersects with how politics then is kind of created for these regions. But yeah.
When you saw, for example,
One of the Israelis' tactics was to punish journalists in the Gaza Strip. In particular, family members of particular Palestinian journalists. As part of the journalist fraternity, what has been the opinion in regards to that type of activity? Because generally, one assumes that the fraternity is a type of unit and they seem to understand, and there's a particular level of exposure. But here, it seems like there's been some level of indifference.
There has been, actually. I saw a tweet today. UNRWA, the refugee agency that deals with Palestinians, more than 50 of their workers have been killed in the Gaza Strip. And so these are 50 UN agency workers that have been killed. And in the tweet, kind of offering their condolences, the same UN agency mourns the loss of their staff, but doesn't mention who killed them. And in that sense, you also see how blame is apportioned, how who is deserving of sympathy and who is deserving of being called out. And with, I think, more than 18 journalists have been killed in Gaza. Now, Israel, when you speak to both people on the Israeli side, but also Palestinians in Gaza, Israel knows very well, most of the time, who it's targeting. They know the Gaza Strip quite well. They know who lives in which building. They will call individuals up and say, your house is being targeted. You are such and such family. Get out. And so they know often who they're killing. And so the idea that they don't know they're killing these journalists and their families is dubious at best. And in terms of how journalists in the West treat this part of the fraternity, is probably as second-class citizens of the fraternity. Their deaths are seen as sad, but an unfortunate consequence of war. It also reflects that often ethnic journalists are not seen as being as objective, often being seen as perhaps too close to the story, whereas a white voice on a story is seen as more authentic, is seen as more objective, and is seen as more authoritative. And that says a lot about how the media operates and how it stratifies members of the fraternity.
So, I'm telling you the interview.
No, go for it. It's easier for me as well.
So, one of the things that I started to notice was optics on the internet of his moment, right? And his ability to have Palestinian representatives and somebody did a report from ChatGPT, where ChatGPT showed that Piers Morgan was not objective at all. And the main question was that Piers Morgan's starting point is the starting point of condemnation of October 7th. And you can see that every single person on the Palestinian side feels that this is a trap. As a journalist, what is your opinion about the way that this question is placed? Because it's almost as if Morgan is questioning their humanity before he would be willing to continue with the other line of questioning. So as a journalist, how do you see that line of representation? And then how does one answer that question without feeling a sense of betrayal or entrapment?
Firstly, I'd say Piers Morgan is first and foremost an entertainer. And so if you look at the top videos on YouTube, his all-time top videos, it's been totally populated by his Palestine stories over the last couple of weeks. So out of his top 10, I think, videos, 5 are dealing with Palestinian issues. It's not that he is an experienced enough journalist to know how some of these interviews are going to kind of turn out. And he is deliberately also using a particular narrative or using a particular language to get the person that he's interviewing to react in particular ways. He's being also deliberately controversial up to some point so that he can become the bad guy dealing with the good guy. And so I would also treat him partly skeptically because he's an entertainer, first and foremost. Secondly, in regards to the question, there was a recent kind of interview on a British TV channel in which the Palestinian ambassador to the UK was being interviewed, and 6 members of his family had been killed, and the interviewer says to him, "I'm sorry about the deaths in your family, but surely you don't condone Hamas." And that line of questioning was considered as very dehumanizing, was also seen as quite unfair because the same question is rarely posed to Israelis. And the reason why kind of that juxtaposition exists in part is because the other is seen as first and foremost, to get a seat on the table, you have to prove your credentials. You have to go through a checklist. Are you one of us, or are you one of them? The same doesn't exist necessarily for Israelis, because they're already one of us. They're already part of the European family, or Western civilization. And so that question doesn't then need to be asked. And so, how do you escape from that trap? I think often what I've seen in these interviews is the person that has been posed this question has rarely called them out in that moment. And I think it's only in hindsight that someone can realize the ridiculousness of that question, or they require further training, actually.
So that goes into my next point, which is that for
people who are here today, like, I'm not expecting people here to be a journalist or whatnot, but what type of training do they require in order for them, if they are chosen for whatever fields they're in, to interact with the media, what sort of training can be offered for them to be able to deal with this sort of situation? Because, I mean, it's an emotional onslaught, and what you see afterwards is the coordination takes place a little later. By then, you know, it's over. So, in your professional opinion, somebody who's very executive, what type of training do you think would be useful in trying to deal with this situation?
I think training for these kind of things tends to be immensely difficult in part. So you look at a lot of the Israeli spokespeople, they've had usually significant amounts of training in terms of they are sat down and pose different questions, hard questions, and they have to think either on their feet or you learn stock answers. We don't necessarily, as a community, have that kind of financial power to be able to hire media gurus to train us. That's one element. We also don't have the bandwidth as a community to deal with some of these things. It's also a very vocational thing, which is the more you do interviews, the more you practice the craft, the better you become at picking up the nuances. I don't have a simple answer in terms of what kind of training, but if you decide to go into journalism, then you pick it up along the way. Is my best answer. I'm sorry.
This will be my last question, and I'll open the floor. As somebody who's as a Muslim who's worked in this industry and the environment, where do you see us going forward in regards to how we can carve out a space for ourselves? I mean, clearly, we don't have, I mean, TLT or the Middle East have Muslim journalists, but it doesn't have a platform which is necessarily fitting within a framework or paradigm which is Muslim producers. It's still a Western model, a Western framework, but then we sprinkle a bit of, this and that on top of it, and then we try to find a way of navigating that space. Do you think that Muslims can find a way of having internal voice within the mechanisms that are existing, or can they carve out an external space where they can be heard? And does that necessarily have to replicate legacy media, or can it be done on another platform?
I think it's it's a hard question.
You don't have to answer.
No, but, okay. I think places like Al Jazeera have shown that something else is possible, but even that comes with caveats, and they are also limited by kind of the politics. I think it's very difficult to escape from the model of legacy media, in part because so much of the media is also linked in with politics and with geopolitics. And the reason why we listen to what's coming out of the US is because it's the most powerful country. And if tomorrow it wasn't the most powerful country, then it would be a different kind of situation. And so it's kind of the horse or the cart, what comes first. And probably you need powerful countries to then be able to produce powerful media outlets that in part reflect legacy media, but then unless you have the power as a country, then you can't also experiment with other kind of models. So a lot of the major media outlets in the world are backed by particular powerful states, and the BBC can be objective up to some point, but they're still getting the government money. And CNN is widely seen as the voice of the a particular type of American government. And so these institutions are also backed up by their political benefactors, whether openly or not is something else.
We're going to leave it there.
Okay.
So we're going to give you guys a 10-minute break.
Oh, I haven't finished that yet.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
No.
Okay, go.
So,
Do you want to,
yeah, so
sorry, bro. Go on.
I'll wrap it up quickly.
Here you go.
So can you trust the numbers? So recently the death of Palestinians was called in question by, firstly, a presenter on a British TV show, then by the Israeli government, then by Joe Biden. And you can see how the media is also manipulated to push particular ideas through. So both the Israeli government, the British presenter, and the US government said that they do not trust the number of deaths coming out of Gaza. Now, the preface to this is that Hamas has been, and the Palestinians have been dehumanized. And if you've dehumanized the population, then anything that comes out of the territory is seen as illegitimate. The point of this is also to use the media to muddy the water. So the media both has agency, but it's also sometimes a passive actor in some of these things. And so politicians know that whatever they say on certain topics will be covered and will become part of the news cycle. Journalists feel compelled to cover it. And so when the US president goes on national TV and says he has no trust in the Palestinian numbers, that becomes the story. And now it calls into question completely on whether the Palestinians are telling the truth about how many of them are being killed. Once this has been said, often allies and proxies in the media, who are also journalists, will echo some of these narratives and talking points, and they will preface the Palestinian health ministry with Hamas-run health ministry, when 2 news segments ago, the same journalist has probably called Hamas evil, callous, and barbaric. And can we then really trust what Hamas says? Now, on this story, on the death of Palestinians, the Gaza Health Ministry released a 200-page list of all the names and the identity numbers. Huffington Post published an article a few days afterwards in which they had examined US State Department cables over the last 3 weeks and found that even the US State Department in private was relying on the numbers from the Gaza Ministry of Health without any caveats, because they had used them in the past before and had found them to be reliable. Human Rights Watch had used them, UN agencies had used them, and all had found that in previous assaults in Gaza, the numbers tallied up roughly to what they had. And so then it begs the question of why muddy the water? And you muddy the water if you want to kind of use the media to push a particular narrative. You also then instrumentalize the media and make it part of the information warfare. Now, by the time the truth came out about these numbers, most people had heard the headline, numbers of Palestinian deaths can't be trusted. Why? Because Hamas. In 48 hours' time, by the time this was cleared, the news agenda has moved on, the events have moved on, the statement has been made. So this is how one aspect of how the media is used also in time. Which leads me to my kind of final and third point. How do we talk about deaths in the media? And so there was an interesting BBC, in the early days of the war, tweet that went viral and said more than 500 people have died in Gaza after Israel launched a massive retaliatory airstrike. Whereas for Israelis, it said more than 700 people have been killed. And I'm sure probably a lot of you saw it. Palestinians die, Israelis are killed. How Palestinians die, we never find out. So that's part of the passive and active language that's used to influence how we see events. But also how the deaths are attributed and to whom they're attributed to is also another point that the media is an active participant in. So when the Gaza hospital Al-Hali, sorry for butchering the name, was attacked, the media was very quickly to exercise caution. Who did it? And we have to wait for the evidence and the investigation. But many in the same media, when there was unverified reports of Hamas decapitating babies, saw fit to run the headline without it being confirmed. And so this comes back to the racialization. when Palestinians say something, when Palestinians say that this was done by Israel, that requires further confirmation. When Israelis say that Hamas has done something to them, that's seen as fact. And that's in part because the Israelis are seen as truthful, whereas the Arabs and the Muslims are not. I'll conclude with direction. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. If you guys can have like a 10-minute break, and then just some fresh air, breathe your legs a little bit, and then we're ready to roll, okay? There's a message. You just go straight in, one on the left.
Where are you?
Okay, Assalamualaikum everyone. Okay, so this is our last speaker. We are ready to roll, inshallah. Those of you at the back, if you can please keep your voices down, I can hear you. Thank you very much. Okay, so our last speaker of the day, and I know that it's been a long day, and I really appreciate you being here, and those of you who are online, thank you very much. Our last speaker is Oais Khan. Now, Oais is I found him to be an exceptional thinker who I personally believe should be more visible for many of us as Muslims in terms of the thoughts and ideas. That's not a slight on him by saying that he should be visible. My point is that we should know who he is. So, for me, I'm really grateful that he's here today. And I really hope that after Oasis talk, because remember that after these presentations are finished, I want you to be in contact with the presenters as a way of trying to kick on from this and go forward. So I really hope that you make use of that. And so for Oasis, the floor is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I want to thank the Institute of Islamic Studies and Istanbul University. This institute has a very special place for me because one of the old faculty members here was Muhammad Hamidullah, who was from Hyderabad, where my family is also from. And so I pay homage to him and his service. And I also want to thank Dr. Yaqub for putting this together. Anyways, I want to start by saying praise to Allah, who created us and made us Muslims, and sent our Prophet, who is our sovereign, who established the first city-state, Muslim city-state, and who led armies for justice, and who was both victorious, and he was also the healer of the community. So I say blessings and peace upon him and upon those who follow his path. My topic today is titled Political Theology of Muqawama, and it seems like PowerPoint has problems with Arabic because I don't know what happened, but it didn't do the Arabic properly. Anyways, political theology is a sub-discipline of political theory. Maybe most of you are not familiar with it, so I'll give a small introduction. It can be best qualified as like it's a postmodern and post-secular discourse. In the sense it's postmodern because its birth is traced back to after World War I. European thinkers began to really question how, after a cycle of modernity, the problem of fascism and totalitarianism took hold of Europe. And what they noticed was that the political ideologies that they were facing were not just secular in nature, but there was something beyond reason that was infused in these modern ideologies, which led to the death of millions of people. So, in that sense, political theology is a critique of modernity in its fundamental secular commitments. That secular logics and secular thought could create a progressive future for not just the world, but for Europe. At the same time, the death and destruction that came at the turn of the century also prompted some Christian theologians to begin to question what was assumed to be the separation of church and state. And they began to ask the questions about, doesn't Christianity have anything to say about justice, about suffering, And so from there were born, things that, movements that we know today amongst Catholic and Protestant theologians as like liberation theology or social theology, etc. So there's from two separate fields, a convergence that took place. And that literature is known as political theology. And it's important for us as Muslims because it allows us to look into the deep kind of corners of European thought, where there are corners that they probably don't want us to look at, right? In which theology plays a crucial role in forming modern ideas. So that's why I chose political theology. I studied political theology as a discipline. And then I chose the term muqawama because I think that is what we are called on to do now. So it's best for us to understand where does the concept of muqawama stand in terms of this larger intellectual history. So let me begin by trying to take a bite size of off of the larger idea of political theology and trying to hone in on one particular idea that I think is very important. And I want to use in this moment to do a little bit of self-reflection about how the Ummah is responding to the current crisis. I have to say that, we probably are feeling in this room after the full day's worth of reflecting on Palestine that we aren't doing enough. And Dr. Yaqub's call to action is of course something that we should take outside of this room. But action is always downstream from thought, right? And probably because we didn't have enough meetings like this, years ago, right? We're faced with the reality that is before us now. So, I appreciate this context of reflection that this allows us to do. So reflecting on what happened, I want to look at the OIC and the meeting that took place. 20 resolutions were passed, and I read them. And if you have a chance, you should read them as well. But from the resolutions, what we gather is that Muslim countries, including Turkey, limited their solidarity with the resistance of Palestine in terms of secular liberal norms embodied in international law. That is clear from the resolutions. So my basic claim is that in doing so, Muslim countries, including Turkey, are insincere and also, in a certain sense, condemning themselves to irrelevance from the resistance on the ground, right? Because the contest over the Holy Land has and will remain intensely theological. And I'm going to start to show you how. The desire to speak desire to speak in terms of secular humanitarian discourse stems from the idea that such a language is somehow less theological and therefore more neutral than scientific. And it will empower the resistance on the ground. However, my argument in this presentation, I hope you take this away, is that in fact it does the opposite, right? And once we understand the theological nature of secular language itself, we'll be in a better place to assess how much we should hang our hat on secular international law. So if you look at the OIC's October final resolution, what you find is words such as humanitarian aid, Geneva Conventions, displacement, genocide, apartheid, collective punishment, self-determination, settler colonialism, blaming Israel to have full responsibility as an occupying power. Much of this you've probably also heard in the media over the last 2-3 weeks. There's only two places in the whole resolution where we encounter something of a Muslim language. And the word ummah is used once, and then there's a very strange reference to all of these actions taken by Israel as being against, quote, divine laws. And divine laws here, they use a weird, and I looked at the Arabic version, and it says Sharia Samawiya, which I don't know what that means. Like, okay. And I think they don't mean like the Sharia as we think about it, but I think they mean like general religious values or something like that. So let me get to the three strategies that I feel like Muslim countries have used, and one of them is to be vague on Hamas, right? And vague on the resistance that's happening in Gaza. And this has actually been a part and parcel of the process of normalization. So the ambiguity and vagueness around Hamas has led to a way of justifying inaction. So even like very close to October 7th, sources out of the Gulf especially were talking about, Islamic resistance organizations as being terrorist organizations, right? And this is completely against the Geneva Conventions itself. So in the Geneva Conventions, for instance, in an armed conflict, those who are irregular soldiers are documented as having the right to self-determination, right? So if you're occupied and you're resisting under an occupation with arms, it is those people are categorized as to be taken as prisoners of war. That means that they are legitimate fighters in the conflict. In any case, the idea of deeming Hamas as a terrorist organization has no grounding in the academic literature, right? And this is something you should know, because sometimes we are confused about that. In the academic literature, the definition of terrorism excludes any activity, violent activity that happens in the theater of war. So if there is a conflict, right, and there is violence that is taking place in the context of a larger liberation struggle, then that group cannot be called a terrorist. A terrorist, in academic literature, is under conditions of peace in which a political organization tries to use terror in order to achieve political goals. But in an armed conflict, where two sides are fighting, right, you cannot call one side a terrorist, right? That just doesn't, it's not part of the definition. However, according to the American definition, and there is one, the one that the Americans use, has such a broad definition that almost any organization could be deemed a terrorist organization. But this is not validated by the UN, the American definition, nor is it validated by any academic study of terrorism. So that should be, and Muslim countries have purposefully been vague, and their vagueness comes from the fact of capitulation to interests that are elsewhere, right? So European definitions and American definitions have no authority globally. It would have been one thing if there was some kind of academic consensus on the matter, but there is not one. And there is no international consensus. The UN has failed to produce a definition of terrorism over this issue. So, using that label is just one of the tools to delegitimize resistance. The second strategy and I think, and I'm going to speak more about these later, is to try to use the media in a way to try to reframe the conflict. So in trying to do so, they're trying to maximize the rights under international law for Palestinians. So, reiterating, for instance, ideas of settler colonialism, displacement, collective punishment, these are all ways of trying to flag a public, to solidify a public record that would later hopefully be used to maximize Palestinian rights under international law. And lastly, Muslim countries are steeped in humanitarian diplomacy, through which the idea is to validate the humanity of Palestinians, right? And by speaking about aid in the Gaza Strip, the overall strategy is to try to restore the humanity that has been lost to Palestinians. And I think my overall point in this presentation will be, I think there's something deeply, deeply wrong about all of these strategies, right? The presentation is a kind of ad hoc note under conditions that are obviously ongoing and developing. But I'm inviting you to also think about that. So the idea of using the media and having a media campaign to use secular, liberal, international categories and concepts, or to try to use aid diplomacy in order to restore the humanity, all of this has one reference point. And I think this is all geared towards trying to validate international humanitarian law. So I think it's very important then to take a moment to try to see about the emergence of international humanitarian law. And international humanitarian law is developed through a process of secularization, right? And I use the word secularization because the rules of war, instinctually in Europe and beyond, were never seen as secular concepts. Because war requires something from us, which is sacrifice, which is not a secular concept. So, for instance, if we look at, from the period of secularization when these categories got secularized, where we ended up before the arrival of the human as a category of law, we had, in Europe, the idea of the infidel and war as crusade. Right? And this was the main kind of way that law was framed. And if you look particularly at the last crusade, I think the last major crusade, in my opinion, which is the transition to the modern world, which was the reconquest of Spain. They used the language of what is called, purity of blood. So a number of papal bulls were issued in which Christians were distinguished from non-Christians based upon whether or not they were sanctified with pure blood, right? And this comes from basically a Eucharistic logic in which Christians, when they digest the blood and body of Christ, their blood is purified. And those who have impure blood were questioned whether or not they even had a soul. And the doctrines of what is called the doctrine of discovery, which is a number of other papal bulls that inaugurated colonization of non-European lands, was an extension of the reconquista of Spain, the reconquest of Spain. Because the justification for the doctrine of discovery, which now we know as being, was used in, for instance, the U.S. Supreme Court to justify the dispossession of Native American land in the United States. This doctrine was primarily geared towards Muslims, actually. So when Columbus, for instance, justified Queen Isabella that he wants to discover the New World, his case was that there's Muslims still out there, right? He argued that there are Moors that will harm us, and we need to track them down. And the budget that Columbus got was a budget that came straight out of the budget that was assigned to the conquest of Spain, right? And the doctrine of discovery are these papal bulls that the Pope sanctioned to allow for Christians to go and continue a crusade abroad. How we get from there to a doctrine of international law which tries to create a world peace and tries to create the human as a political subject is a very interesting journey. But in between, we have the transition from pure blood to race, right? And the 19th century is a critical point in which the colony serves as this place where you can continue crusade against the heathen, but you can civilize at home. You can civilize within Europe. And the colony becomes this empty land, right, where a wilderness, where once again Europe can exercise its religious rights over humanity. But at the same time, there was a push within Europe to start to begin to civilize at home. And that's why, for instance, Du Bois, when he talked about what happened, he said the question of the 19th and 20th century is the question of the color line. Because enmity during this period was transformed from an issue of pure blood and purity of blood. I think in Spanish it's called limpieza de sangre or something like that. And it was transformed into pure race, right? And eugenics and scientific racism and all of these other disciplines, scientific disciplines, came to establish race as a category in which the colony as a site of crusade could be justified. So that's why Francisco de Vitoria, who was the founder of international law, wrote a book called On the Law of War Made by Spaniards on the Barbarians, right? And what he was speaking about, and the whole book is just about, do these people that we're conquering have souls or not? And if they do, what are the consequences for us, right? So this is the background, and in the 19th century, international law as it grows, we have to remember that international law remained as a tool of imperialism well into the 20th century, because in international law, both in Article 21 of the League of Nations, for instance, you read Article 21, the Monroe Doctrine was completely authorized there. And the Monroe Doctrine is nothing but a continuation of the doctrine of discovery on the continent of the United States. And Article 5 in the UN allows for paradigms of collective security, right? And paradigms of collective security are nothing other than a European Christian, ability to safeguard themselves against the other. So what we see here is what scholars have called the migration of the holies, right? A process that started in the Middle Ages but continues even till today, in which symbols, ideas that were once used for submission to the church were transferred over to the state. And this process is what they call migration of the holies. So, for example, what was once owed to the Pope and the language around the Pope as the infallible representative of God on earth was then transferred to the state, right? And your loyalties, here I'm speaking about European loyalties, were transferred to the state. Now, this migration of the holies, which is a process that's quite, worth its own investigation, leads to what people have called a kind of quantum entanglement between political ideas and theological ideas. So when modern political ideas, it's not just about a story of depletion of meaning or disenchantment, whereby you had religious ideas, and then when they got transferred into modern secular ideas, that this genealogy leads to a depletion of meaning. But rather, what you end up with is a quantum entanglement. What I mean by that is, when you play with fundamental political ideas, you're also playing with fundamental theological ideas, and vice versa, right? And this is why political theology as a discipline is not about particular religious judgments. So like when you should go to jihad, or what you should do, or how. This is not what it's about. It's about studying on the level of concepts, how the construction of concepts are quantumly entangled with theological ideas. And so let me quickly go forward. So what I want to talk about is that after 1945, right? So after 1945, we get a new structure whereby laws that were meant for Christian white people now apply to humanity as a whole. Because before 1945, there was always the presence of the colony. And the colony, even throughout the period of racism in Europe, allowed for Europeans to continue the Holy War, right? A land where barbarians and heathens lived who required enlightenment and justice from Europe. But once we get past 1945, we see an attempt to try to include all of humanity into this European framework. And decolonization is one of the ways in which this happens. And so now I think 193 nations have signed up to the Geneva Conventions that were the second Geneva Conventions. I don't know, the fourth one I think it's called. And my argument here is that this creates a kind of contradiction, right? The contradiction is that it is impossible to base enmity and war on liberal principles, because it is a contradiction to both claim universal humanity on the one hand, but also claim another human being as an enemy. So those two things cannot coincide. And they coincided before because you always had the heathen, you always had the infidel, right? So two Christians, for instance, could recognize that they both were pure-blooded, you know, they had pure, sanctified blood. Or two European Anglo-Saxons or white people who possess white, they could recognize that they both had souls, right? And they were both rational beings. But when you extend those privileges to a universal of all humanity, then you create a contradiction. Because now you both have to recognize the humanity, and you also have to go to war with those same people. Because there's no other way to go to war but to basically annihilate and dehumanize someone else. So the point here is that the secularization of enmity, right? From going from the idea of a crusade and holy war, which is very distinct to Europe. You know, it's a very distinct to European ideas, and then trying to eradicate this idea and try to go to war against now humans leads to a contradiction in which the only way to go to war is to claim that your enemy is not human. So secular liberal international law is the source of the inhumanity of the enemy. Because there's no other way to justify war. So, Hamas is a terrorist organization. Gazans, all of them, Palestinians are terrorists. You know, it is the source of violence, the inhumane violence that we experience today. So, you know, using the same framework to try to liberate or save or protect Palestinians is missing the fundamental fact that the war and enmity against them will continue to treat them as inhumans. And you may ask me, well, why do we have to? Why can't we just acknowledge that they're humans and go to war with them? Well, that is what international liberal humanitarian law is promising us, that we could go to war with rules, and we could go and we could, you know, somehow respect their humanity. But the trouble is that from the beginning of time, people realized that war is such an activity that it requires an act of, I use this word purposely, transcendence. That means that you have to go beyond the political community to find the enemy. Because so long as you're within the political community, you know, there could be violations of justice, but they're treated as crime, they're treated as murder, right? But that's not war, right? War is specifically for someone who is outside, who is other than the political community, right? So this act of othering is an act of faith, it's an act of transcendence. And the trouble with it is that war then is entangled with our ideas of transcendence. And here, I think Christianity is very important to understand international humanitarian law. Because if war requires this othering, and if war requires this struggle against someone who is not part of the political community, then how you theorize transcendence is very important. And the problem with Christianity is that Christianity, which is the source of our modern political ideas, imagines transcendence as a struggle against pure evil. So Christianity is essentially a Gnostic tradition, a Gnostic offspring of a Judaic past. You know, and on their own claims, this Gnosticism creates such a disgust for the worldly, for the material, right? So the idea of Christianity is basically to break the laws, right? To break the Jewish material laws, to look at sex, violence, and wealth as a source of deep corruption, and they corrupt absolutely, and to try to find a pathway to God that overcomes the limitations of the world, right? And so this Gnostic disgust for the mundane, the ordinary, and the worldly create a radical desire of rapture, right? Leaving the world, right? And that means that the way you theorize the world, in this case, the thing that you want to overcome, right, is the enemy. And that thing deserves your utmost disgust, and it is pure evil. Right? That's why, I mean, this may seem a little bit more superficial, but that's why monks, for instance, they live apart from society, they don't marry, they're not supposed to earn money, they're not supposed to be violent, they're not supposed to go to war, etc. This is because they sanctify themselves by not involving themselves in the world, because the world is pure evil. Right? And it's the source of all evil. So, and I think what this creates is a kind of political idea. So when we move from the theological back to the political, it means that the enemy is a source of pure evil. The enemy is, the fight with the enemy is a cosmic war, right? It's a cosmic war, and this fight requires extraordinary, irrational acts of martyrdom. Okay? So this is the framework on which war and enmity is imagined. Yeah, and it is a Gnostic understanding. So I think I kind of drove that point home, so I'll keep going. I'm almost done, 2 more slides. So Carl Schmitt was mentioned earlier. He's one of the writers on political theology, and he has a famous line that keeps running in my mind. He says, "A people is only then conquered when it subordinates itself under a foreign vocabulary, a foreign understanding of what is law, and especially what international law is." Right? And I think this point is very important for us to understand now. We obviously, Muslims, have a long and very complicated and very sophisticated notion of what struggle and jihad means. But this idea of jihad in our tradition is not isolated. It comes with a whole theological background. And one of those points that you have to know is that Sunni Orthodoxy in particular is an anti-Gnostic tradition. It's an anti-Neoplatonic tradition. It's a tradition that does not look at the world as pure evil. And therefore its enemy, right? So its enemy can never be pure evil. Right? So there is a struggle. And if we look at our ideas of sacrifice, and these are ideas that I'd like to explore later, but jihad, as the Prophet has explained, is first of all jihad against self. And that's something that really is important to understand, because a part of yourself can never be pure evil. Right? So there is a struggle internally, and when we manifest this struggle externally against the enemy, we are only fighting actually a part of ourselves. And so we never see the enemy as a pure evil either, right? And that's what's the wisdom behind how the Prophet described Jihad al-Asghar and Jihad al-Akbar, which is that these are two ideas connected to each other. And in that is the anti-Gnosticism, of our tradition. There's a lot more to be said about that, but at the end of the day, a Muslim doctrine of war and enmity is a doctrine that understands that the enemy is human. Because, as you remember, Jihad al-Asghar is a battle against yourself, and there's no part of yourself that is not human. And so when you struggle against the enemy externally, you're also fighting against humans. And that acknowledgement makes it primarily different from what war becomes under international humanitarian law. Muslim concepts of enmity are humane because they recognize that the enemy is also human. And what we're witnessing now in Gaza, right, is the product of a civilization and a world that denies the humanity of the Palestinians, who treats them as animals, who kills babies and has no mercy, because that's the only way to go to war. Modern war, its technologies and tactics, cannot make liberal humanitarian war possible. Okay? And this inhumanity that we see folding in front of us is the product of secular law. And we're not able to articulate this because of the myth of religious violence. That somehow violence produced by religion is irrational and fanatical, while violence produced by secular law is not. So I will just end on trying to dive into understanding how this plays out on the ground, right? So Muqawamah on the ground has two aspects. what we see, the armed conflict on the ground right now is one aspect. But there is a greater conflict that Palestinians have spoken about over the last decade, which is called Samud, right? And if you understand in the Quran and elsewhere, when faced with calamity, there's sabr wa salah, right? There's both. And when you enter into the violent conflict, that requires sabr, right? To face the difficulties of jihad. But on the everyday mundane life, it requires samud, right? Which is symbolized by salah, right? It's the on the ground Palestinians express that by a constant struggle not to flee under occupation, not to leave the land. That when they destroy an olive tree, that they plant another one. When they roll down, they bulldoze someone's house, they build another one. No matter how much terror is inflicted, they stay. So this constant everyday violence that is put against them, they show their constant everyday struggle as samud. And yes, at the same time, there is jihad, right? And there's resistance against the enemy. And so, and this is, again, under international law, regardless of international law, Israel is not a country that recognizes borders. So I don't understand on what grounds anybody is saying that, Gaza invaded Israel. Where is Israel? I would like to know. Where's the map? Where are the borders? Where can we go? Where can we not go? Right? So when Israel itself doesn't recognize borders, there's no talk of invasion. I don't understand where this idea of invasion came from. So, so defending against the occupier is a particular kind of jihad, and that's why muqawamah is so important. And the last is what I started with, which was, as we walk through all of these things and we try to think about, well, what could be done? So, first of all, I want to note about the hypocrisy, right, of defending the muqawamah on the ground, but at the same time constantly seeking liberal permission, right? Permission of the Security Council, right? Permission of I don't know who, right? This is probably the most hypocritical position that is embodied in the OIC statement, right? So the people on the ground in Gaza don't seek permission, right? Who do they seek permission from? Why are Muslim countries, for instance, who use this opportunity to score political points and who stand next to in solidarity, why don't they, show solidarity with the non-permission seeking of the Palestinians? Why go and try to seek permission in the UN Security Council? Lastly, I'd say is we need to avoid, I have utmost respect to those who work in media and those who've given their life, trying to show. And thank God that we have Al Jazeera and Middle East Eye today, we have TRT World and Anadolu Agency, who are non-stop covering what's happening in Gaza. And had they not been there, we wouldn't even know what's happening. And thank God for that. But really, the desire to reframe the narrative, the desire to try to create a new, to talk in terms of, my question is, what narrative are you reframing? And the media games, if it's directed towards, once again, appealing to international humanitarian law, I have a question. Where is our hope coming from? And I think Dr. Yaqub started today by recentering our discussion about, are we aligned towards Allah or not? Two other points that I think are important are that I don't understand why supplying of weapons and military intervention, even according to international law, the so-called international law that people are putting to, is outlawed right now. There is historical precedence, and it's something that Muslim countries should show a greater interest in thinking about. Humanitarian aid is not what's needed. And I know that sounds harsh, and I will explain to you why. Humanitarian aid is an appeal to try to humanize Palestinians, but they're already human for us. And why are we crying at night watching the videos? It's because they're already human. We have nothing to prove. And the people that you want to convince that are human have already decided that they're inhuman. That's why they're going to war. So I don't understand what the game is about, right? So my question is, thinking in terms of our own Islamic position is enough to license action. We don't need any other permission seeking. And I want to give two examples of recent history of Turkey. Right? In 1974, Turkey invaded Cyprus because they were foreseeing a genocide happening in that country. But then in 1995, no one moved. And we watched the world murder like 10,000 Bosnians. My question is, what is the difference between those who live in Cyprus and those who live in Bosnia? Right? And my question is like, why did you mobilize military on Cyprus? And this is not just about Turkey, it's about, and the reason there is that because they were Turks. Right? That's the logic. But really, is there a difference between Bosnians who were left in Bosnia after the Ottoman Empire and those left in Cyprus after the Ottoman Empire? Is really there a difference? Right? And you should remember that in 1974, Turkey was threatened by American military, by 3-year sanction, but they did it anyways. And that capacity, that ability to action requires no authorization. It requires no permission, right? And the reason for that is that we are a community that has our own law, and we have a law that is more humane, and we have a law that recognizes the humanity in our enemies, and we have the ability to decide who the enemy is and who the friend is. And those categories cannot be justified through international humanitarian law. Lastly, another critique that I would say is that we need to do samud in daily life, right? By that I mean is that solidarity with the Palestinians is also suffering with them. Imagine if it was your brother. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. Fast for them. Why is food halal for you and it's haram for them? Why is sleep halal for you and haram for them? So wake up with the tahajjud, do samud in your daily life. Because the fight against international humanitarian law is also a struggle to keep your faith here. There's no difference. And lastly, I'll say, this is something that I talked about earlier, which I may have been controversial, is to reject the idea of proportionality, which is so much in the news now, right? How many Palestinian lives or how many Israeli lives? Is that really a conversation you want to get into? It's a really irrational discussion because we're living in Istanbul right now, and if you ask the number of people who live here, how many lives is Istanbul worth? We have historical precedent of this. I mean, Yaqub Hoxha is an Ottoman historian. How many people died in the Battle of Çanakkale? How many lives is Istanbul worth? Now I ask you the question, how many children's lives is Aqsa worth? Is there an answer you can actually give? What logic are you using? Are you using the logics of proportionality and international law? or are using the logic of, your deen. And when you think about it really carefully, we raise our children so that they may one day defend Medina and Makkah. I mean, is there any other purpose, really, of raising children than that they may defend the honor of the Ummah, that they have the right to defend Makkah? So, my point is that weeping over the bodies of dead children, right, and Aqsa, of course it hurts, of course, as all sacrifice hurts. I have no doubt about that, and I've cried myself. But, showing patience and sabr at this time is what is required, because, all of our children can be qurban for Allah's son. I don't think that the Ummah is worth continuing if Aqsa is gone. I don't think the Ummah is worth continuing if Medina is gone, or Makkah is gone. So my question is, why whine about the children? Right? Like, why? Why not join, the Muqawama with our children? Isn't it why we raise our children in the first place? Do we raise our children to become doctors and lawyers, or, I don't know, financial analysts or something? No, obviously not. So when that is threatened, showing solidarity with the mothers of Palestine isn't sitting here and watching the spectacle. That's not solidarity. Because they've decided that their children, all of them, qurban for Palestine. And that's what they're showing us. Now what do we do? So don't be fazed by sacrifice or the call for sacrifice. It's not something that's from our deen. And I will end there.
Okay, unfortunately we can't take any Q&A that there has to be on my WhatsApp. But I would like you to engage in a way so once we go outside we can maybe sit down somewhere and talk to him inshallah, because the body of what we did today was a lot of information. In the beginning there was a tone that we wanted to set, and at the end there was a tone that's particularly set. And I want to stress this without any hesitation. As a Muslim, there's always going to be a struggle between Iman and Kufr. We don't hate the Kufr. The problem we have is Kufr. And when you look at China, when you look at Russia, when you look at the United States of America or Israel, it's Kufr. And when they were telling us at the universities that this is not a clash of civilizations, and blah blah blah, falan, okay with you, but this is definitely a clash of Iman and Kufr. And we are the people of Iman. Now, how you see that struggle is up to you. You need to now get proactive in terms of what does it mean to be the people of Iman, and what does it mean in terms of Kufr. And if the word Kufr is up to your ears, then let me make it more palatable with the English language. It's a conflict between Iman, those who believe in Allah Ta'ala and His Messenger, and non-Islam. And non-Islam. People who do not want peace, people who do not want justice, people who do not understand humanity. They're enjoying this dunya over here. Just be aware of that, inshallah. Okay? So, yes, they get very agitated, we're going to stop it here, but please, if you have any questions, engage always outside. And once again, we are here. I hope people to you are living in the city. You have human resources. You have human institutions in the city. Find us if you want to learn something, if you want to do something, if you want to go forward. The whole point of this was not for it to simply be foreign Muslims, Turkish Muslims, even though it's in English. We need to go forward in this country if we want to see our children represent Islam. So please, if there's anything you can take away from this, Oasis' last words about our children are very important. It is a responsibility on you to educate your children, just as much as you feed them. But it's a responsibility that you make sure your children represent the interest of Allah Ta'ala. Allah Ta'ala does not need us, we need Him. And if that means every single Muslim is is obliterated from this dunya, so be it. It's Allah Ta'ala that we worship. Remember that. They're going to make us sound like we're crazy. But just listen to what you're listening to right now. And I think I always make a valid point about the language that we're using. Alright, everyone, thank you very much for coming. Assalamu alaikum.
Osman Bey'le metrostation